at the time that Christianity began, you have to understand, like, the whole Mediterranean was being influenced by Hellenism at this time. You had Alexander the Great had conquered a lot of stuff. You have his generals after him had continued to try and control things. So there's a lot of influence of Hellenistic ideas going through all the cultures, and a lot of diverse cultures around. You have the Syrians, you have the Anatolians, you've got the Jews, you got the Egyptians. So there's influences coming around all over the place, and people are seeing these kinds of trends going around. And you have one particular trend is the mystery religions that spread, and there's a variety of these mystery religions. Every national culture that came under the influence of Hellenism developed their own version of this mystery religion concept, and every single one is different, but it's different because you take the local culture, the local religion, and put it into this basic shell, this basic model, and you get a different religion, but there are these common features they're in there, this package, essentially. So you get Osiris and Isis cult in Egypt, you get Adonis cult in Syria, you get the Thracians had Zalmoxis cult. And you see all of these different religions with these savior gods, and they're always the savior, son of God. Occasionally they're a daughter of God, but they're not the supreme God. They're a sort of intermediary child of God. So this demigod that is their savior figure, and they undergo some sort of great struggle or suffering, sometimes actually, in fact, a death and resurrection. And through that suffering or struggle, they gain victory over death that they can share with their followers. And then they do that through the followers sharing communion, so they have these common meals, and through baptism, so they get initiated through baptism. And these are like the core features. And one of the particular aspects of it is the mysteries, which is the idea of these secret doctrines that insiders were told, that outsiders are not told. But you have to join up, get initiated, and then you'll be told the secrets that you need to know to basically get advancement in the afterlife. And these are the common features of the mystery religions. And there are broader sociological features that are very common to them. So they're very cosmopolitan, so they're trying to unite all races and cultures, and in most cases genders. Everyone is, when they join, they become part of a fictive family, a fictive kin group. So you call each other brother and sister, father and mother, and things like this, just as people are familiar with the Christians doing. But this was already the model of the mystery religions going around. And syncretism is one of these features where you have this basic core model, but then you take the local religion and import it in, and you create something new. That's common to all of these things. And the individualism. So the original pagan cults and things of this time were usually communal religions, in the sense that you would participate in the cult in order to guarantee the crops or to guarantee the benefit of the people as a collective. It's not an individual salvation thing. The mystery cults, one of their innovations, one of their features is it's all about personal salvation. It's about your salvation in the afterlife. So how do you get a good place in the afterlife? So you have all of these features, and one on top of that is this trend towards henotheism, this idea there's one supreme God and all the other gods are either created by him or subordinate to him. And even Judaism is henotheistic when you include the fact that angels are really basically just gods. They're just not called gods, but they have all the same features. They're immortal. They have these particular domains of power, and they have supernatural abilities. They live in heaven, So, and then there's demons, of course. So you have like the evil gods. And so you've got this whole, basically this polytheistic system. They just don't call it that. But the mystery religions were doing the same thing. They were carving out this new idea of polytheism where you have the supreme God and you have this hierarchy of deities, and the supreme God is the most important one. And so these features are already going on. So when you see this stuff finally, it's spreading to Syria, it's spreading to Egypt, and so on, and finally you see Judea, it's kind of like the latecomers, like the last one said, well, everybody else has done it, we should do one too. And so if you were, for example, to talk to an expert in ancient religion, like about 100 BC. Varro, for example, wrote this Encyclopedia of Ancient Religion. We don't have it, which is a great loss. But he wrote this Encyclopedia of Ancient Religion, so he was an expert on religion. Now, I'll bet if you went to Varro, and this is a Roman historian and intellectual, and asked him, it's like, okay, you see these mystery religions that are growing up everywhere, Egypt, Syria, and so on. And you know a little bit about Judaism, so if the Jews came up with a mystery religion, describe that religion, and he would write out this description of what that religion would look like, and it would be Christianity to a T. And that tells you something. Like how could you do that if it wasn't really cultural diffusion? It's the same phenomenon you're seeing happen in Egypt and Syria and Thrace and Greece and everywhere else. So basically this group of Jews sort of, whether it was deliberately, whether it was consciously or unconsciously, they're being influenced by this model, and they basically develop their own version of this mystery religion that is very Jewish, but it still conforms to this trend that's going around. And the trend elements are things that are not coming from Judaism generally. They're things coming from the outside, but they make them Jewish. They dress them up as Jewish, and of course sell them as Jewish. They're not saying like we took these ideas from these other cultures. No, they're saying like, no, this has always been God's plan, and God is Jewish, so we're good, right? So that's how Christianity starts out, as this Hellenized Jewish offshoot. This Jewish sect that's sort of offshoot of that. And then, of course, I mean, it really originally began, it was a very Jewish sect. So you had to become a Jew to be a Christian, which means you had to cut off a piece of your penis if you were a man. You had to follow the dietary laws and all of this stuff. But then you had this one particular apostle who came along, Paul, who originally was a persecutor, but then sort of like converted and saw the light and said, well, this is actually a cool cult that I can actually support and become a bigwig in. And so he starts coming up with this idea that this would be way more popular if we just get rid of the Torah requirements of like circumcision and dietary requirements. It would make it much more people would want to join. And I think that's what led to the shift. And of course, the end result was that the church eventually, over decades and decades and decades, got flooded with Gentiles, so the Jewish faction shrank and shrank and shrank. And so it became what we recognize now as Christianity. But it began as this Hellenized Jewish sect. You often run into, especially Christian apologists and stuff, try to sell this idea that Judaism was monolithic and was resistant to all change and influence. There was only one kind of Judaism, and they would not accept anything, and it would just stay that way. But that's not the reality. When you go looking at what was actually going on in the early first century, BC and AD, Judaism was fragmenting. There was tons of diversity in terms of different ways of thinking out their Judaism, different theologies, different philosophies, different models of doing it. And you had multiple sects. I mean, people often hear about the Essenes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, but there are at least 10, possibly as many as 30 sects that we know by name, or by description. Even the Essenes were divided. We have one source says they were basically 7 different sects that were competing, more than 7, maybe 7 to 9 different sects competing with each other. So Judaism was already fragmenting. People were exploring alternative ways to think their Judaism. And a lot of these sects, especially the smaller ones, were countercultural, meaning they were against the elite mainstream Judaism. They were against the temple cult. They were very critical of the Pharisees, for example, and their way of doing things. So there was a lot of opportunity here for influence and for change and for innovation in Judaism, precisely at this point. And so it's not a surprise that Christianity pops up at that time, because this is exactly, you see what's going on. Everybody's doing this within Palestine. So that diversity of Judaism is an important context to understand Christianity in. And when you get to the one sect, and many scholars have tried to argue and pointed out there's a lot of weird similarities based on what we know of the Essenes, which is one particular sect of Jews, and the Christians. They have a lot of similar doctrines that people used to think were unique to Christianity. It turns out, well, guess what? The Essenes had these ideas earlier. And people find that body of ideas also at Qumran, among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so they say, well, that sect must have been an Essene sect. It might have been. It might have been a collection of sects. Who knows? There might have been yet another sect that just had similar ideas. We can't really say for sure because we don't have them calling themselves by name, so we don't know. But it shows that there's a lot of these ideas that became normal in Christianity were already being toyed around with within Judaism before that. But you also look at it, there's scholars have pointed out that when you look at the Gospels, for example, their portrayal of Jesus and his interaction with the Pharisees, his arguments that he has with the Pharisees, they actually read exactly like an internal Pharisee argument. So you actually have, the Pharisees had 2 sects. They had the Hillelites and the Shammaites. And the Shammaites were the conservatives and the Hillelites were the liberals, and they argued with each other. And those arguments look exactly the same. And in fact, Jesus just looks like a Hillelite Pharisee, essentially, the way the character is written in the Gospels. So then there are some scholars suggesting, well, maybe Jesus was originally a Pharisee. And so you can look at a lot of these different sects, and you can see there's pieces of a lot of these sects in early Christianity, and we can't really tell necessarily when they got imported. They might have got imported after it started. They might have been part of the launch. But you also have to think in terms of, where did Christianity come from? It had to be a sect before they came up with this revelation of, oh yes, the Christ figure has sacrificed himself, now the end times have begun, etc. Before that revelation came to them, they were probably already an organized sect in some fashion. They probably had some other set of teachings, and then Cephas, or Peter as we know him, might have actually started this revolutionary movement within that sect and said, oh, guess what? I've had a revelation. Things have changed. The end is coming. The Christ figure has sacrificed himself. We no longer need the temple cult, yada yada. So the question then becomes, what sect was that? Do we know it? Like, was it the Baptist sect, for example? You look at, like, people are associating Jesus with John the Baptist. Was Jesus basically a disciple of John the Baptist? There's a lot of these kinds of questions you can ask. So the fact that there are similarities with the Essenes is not definitive, because we can find similarities with so many other sects, and it's so little that we know in terms of the exact organization on the ground of what was going on sectarian-wise at the origins of Christianity. So we really can't say for sure whether Christianity was an offshoot of the Essenes or influenced by the Essenes, or some sort of amalgam of different sects. We don't know. Yeah, the earliest story of Jesus that we know for sure was written was the Gospel of Mark. That's the earliest one. There may have been versions before, but we don't really have any concrete evidence of that being the case. And we don't have any evidence in Mark. Mark doesn't seem to be aware of there being prior versions of his story. His story seems to be, his own creation. And then all the other Gospels we know of are basically just redactions of Mark. They just take Mark and then add and change stuff. Like there's not really any independent gospel. Even the Gospel of John, which is a total rewrite, is basically a free rewrite in response to the Gospel of Luke, which is just a redaction of Mark. So even when you get like later Gospels, they're basically just more and more distant evolutions of the Gospel of Mark. So Mark seems to be this ground zero of the biography of Jesus. There doesn't seem to be evidence of there being a prior version of that. When you look at the letters of Paul, for example, it's clear that he has no access to some sort of biography of Jesus that's circulating. All his knowledge of Jesus comes from direct revelation from Jesus or from pre-Christian Jewish scriptures. He has no knowledge of these narratives or these ideas that get formulated into the Gospels. So the question comes, where did Mark get these ideas and when did he write them down? And the mainstream consensus is that Mark, of course, wrote after the Jewish War, which means that ended in 70 AD. So he's writing, 20, 30 years after Paul. He's writing 40 years after the origin of the religion. And we have no evidence that there were any eyewitnesses still alive after 70 AD. So we can't even say that he had any eyewitness sources. And he might not have had any actual sources at all. And this is something that I've argued, and we can't know for sure, but I think it's at best 50-50 if you're going to say he has sources or not. We really don't know. But I think it tips a little bit further the other way, because when you look at Mark 4, when Jesus starts, the character Jesus in Mark, when he starts telling his stories about what does the gospel mean, instead of just telling people this is what the gospel means, ABC, I'm going to die for you, and that'll cancel out the temple cult thing, and you get salvation, yada yada, like the straightforward explanation of the whole doctrine. No, he doesn't do that. He starts teaching these obscure parables, and the first time he gives one of these parables, no one understands him, and then his disciples take him aside and goes, "What is this weird stuff you're talking about? We don't understand it." And he says, "Oh, okay, so I'm going to tell these stories to the public specifically so that they won't understand. But you guys, because you're insiders, I'm going to tell you the real meaning of these stories. And the real meaning is not the literal meaning. The literal meaning is a deception. The real meaning is what the meaning of the underlying meaning of the story. What moral does it convey? What deeper truth does it convey?" And then he says, to you, that, and he calls that, these are the mysteries of the kingdom of God that I'm going to convey to you, mystery religion, right? So these are the mysteries. So this is the model. Mark is giving you a clue. He's basically, if you think about it, he's telling you what his gospel is. His gospel is an extended parable. And only the insiders are going to be told the real meaning of all of these passages in the Gospel of Mark. And he has that key, that clue in there. Is like, that's how he's treating his disciples. So if you're reading this and you're imagining yourself as a disciple, you know where you fit into this scheme. It's like, oh, I need the secret teaching. That this is all facade. It's meant to point me to something. I want to figure out what that thing is. And only insiders were given that. And this was a common feature of the mystery religions that made them very popular, right? So you could be an insider and you could feel superior to everyone else because you've got the secret knowledge, and they will laugh at you for the stupid things you believe in, but you don't really know the truth. And it gives you this sort of like this internal cohesion, this internal morale. It makes you even more confident in your religion, because especially when these stories are crafted so brilliantly that you have this emotional reaction to, that's genius, it must come from God, right? This must be inspired by God. This clearly must be true. But it's really just the literary artistry of Mark, right? And people have often said that Mark writes in a low dialect, that like he's like some sort of hick or something. That's not true. He's actually a super skilled, super educated author, whoever he is, but he's choosing to write in a low dialect in the same way that Mark Twain did. And he's doing that because that's his audience, right? So he wants to actually, that's part of the symbol of the gospel, is that this is not a high flowery style. This is a low style because the least shall be first. The poor shall be higher than the rich. It's all part of the gospel model of reversing the order of society. So that's all part of the allegory itself, is just the choice of dialect that he wrote in. And so he tells these stories, and if you read them literally, they're just totally illogical, or they're really implausible. They don't make sense as history. If Jesus walks up to these fishermen and says like 2 words to them, and they drop their and quit their jobs and leave their families and follow him, that doesn't happen in the real world. Like, that would have been like days of conversation for him to persuade them. So even something as simple as that is not a realistic scenario, but it symbolizes the coming to the, it comes up, he teaches, he says, follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. And that's all symbolic of what it means to join the gospel. So it's telling you something about the gospel. It's not meant to be taken literally. And one of my favorite examples, of course, is the withering of the fig tree, where Jesus is hungry and he sees the fig tree. And Mark even says, he goes out of his way to say it's not the season for figs, but Jesus went up there anyway and didn't find any figs, which of course he wouldn't, because it wasn't the season for figs. But he gets angry and curses the tree and says, may you never bear figs again. And then they come back the next day and it's been withered to its very roots. And this makes no, of course it can't happen. Like, people can't wither fig trees. So we know the story is false. Someone made it up for some reason. But it also doesn't even make sense. Even if Jesus had the superpower of withering fig trees, why would he wither and curse a fig tree for not bearing fruit when it's not time for it to bear fruit? Like, what's the point of this? But Mark uses this style of inclusio, where he has one story wrapped around another. There are many stories in Mark that are like this. It's one story wrapped around another. And this story of the fig tree is wrapped around another story, a very famous story, which is the clearing of the temple square. So Jesus comes up, says, may you never bear fruit. It's no longer the season for figs, and may you no longer bear fruit again. Goes into the temple and then curses all the corruption going on in the temple, overturns the tables and stuff like that, and says, we're done with this. Then they come out and then they see the fig tree is withered, and then everybody understands, right? And then Jesus goes on to explain, well, now it's all about prayer and direct contact with God. It's no longer about the temple. So the fig tree is all an allegory for the temple cult. It's no longer the season for that cult anymore. So God's going to wither it to its very roots. So the whole thing is a parable for why God allowed heathens to come in and destroy his own temple. Because it's all a commentary on the Jewish war, right? So he's saying, like, and this is a big crisis for the Jews, right? Like, why would God allow that to happen? His own house, his own temple. He lets these pagans come in and just destroy his holy city, destroy his temple, end the temple cult, which is the central figure, the central piece of Jewish salvation. Why would God let them take that away? So the Jews were struggling with how to explain this. The Christians also, being a Jewish faction, had to also explain this too. Like, why would that happen? And if you're going around, selling this religion, people are going to go, well, yeah, you come from the Jews, and look, your God clearly doesn't hold any juice, right? So they've got to come up with a story for why God would allow this. And this is what we get. And it says, it's no longer the season for that temple cult. We're going to wither it, we're going to curse it, we're going to get rid of it, and we're going to replace it with the gospel of Jesus. And so that's the whole story. It's not meant to be taken literally, but of course it's meant to be taken literally by outsiders who are clueless. But the insiders would be told, like, no, this is the symbol of the gospel. This teaches you what the gospel is about. You're not supposed to take it literally. You're missing the point if you're taking it literally. And there are many other stories in Mark that are like that. And frankly, if you go from story to story to story, you can see they're all like that, actually. So Mark is not writing a memoir. He's not collecting oral lore. He's not writing a history. He's not writing a biography. He's writing a message. And I'm not the only one to argue this. John Dominic Crossan came out with a book called The Power of Parable, where he says, yeah, actually all the Gospels are just extended parables. They're not supposed to be taken literally, originally. At least not by insiders. They might have been meant to be facades to be taken literally by outsiders, but insiders were going to be given the real meaning of it. And so this is how this story begins. And then, of course, decades and decades and decades follow, and then you get certain factions of Christians start selling these things as literally true and really anchoring their faith on them being true, to the point that you get the creeds originally in Paul don't mention Pontius Pilate, don't mention Mary, they don't mention any historical details like that. But by 100 years later, you've got people like Ignatius insisting on, you better believe Pontius Pilate really killed Jesus and that Jesus was really born to Mary, or else you're anathema and we're going to kick you out of our religion. So it becomes obsessively focused on the historicity elements. So you have this faction that's really pushing historicity as a fundamental part of, this is the only way you can be part of our club, is if you buy in to this being literally true. So you have this different version of the sect that arose about 80 to 100 years after it began, and that's the sect that ultimately had the right guy in the right place to get the ear of Constantine and become the religion that was backed by the empire, and then became the religion that dominated the West during the Middle Ages. Just historical happenstance. So we got stuck with the historicist sect, but it didn't really start out that way. Because only Sadducees and Pharisees are mentioned in the Gospels. It's as if the Essenes didn't exist, even though they were around. But there were tons of other sects too. I think the Gospels, or is it Acts? One of the books in the Bible mentions the Herodians, which was one of the sects that we know about that thought that Herod was the Christ, that we know very little about otherwise. Although it might have just been calling them Herodians because as a political faction, it's hard to say. But the religion-wise, the Bible doesn't mention the Essenes. And there have been scholars who pointed this out and said, like, that's kind of weird that, like, you have Josephus, for example, is this Jewish author who wrote a history of the Jews for pagans to understand the Jews. And he talks about his own life, and he says, I went through all the major sects, and he lists them, the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. And he talks about them to try and explain to pagans about how Jewish society is organized. It's the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. He says also on this fourth philosophy, the Zealots. But the main ones, the good ones, were the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. It's always the Essenes, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. And then you go into the Gospels, and suddenly there's Pharisees and Sadducees, but there's no Essenes. Like, why? Where did the Essenes go? And then there's scholars will point out, like, well, that's Jesus, right? So that's the perspective of these authors is the Essenes. That's where the Essenes are, is that you're watching them engage with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And that's a compelling argument. It certainly is an argument for when someone like Mark is writing his gospel. It's an argument for him believing that that's the case, that he thinks that he is the inheritor of the true Essene doctrine. He's writing an Essene gospel, and that's where the Essenes are. So it's like, he's not going to explicitly mention the Essenes because he's the Essene, right? So Jesus is the Essene. The apostles are the Essenes. I think that has some merit to it. Yeah, so you ask about, like, sources. What sources did Mark use? The sources he used, certainly the sources we can, like, really definitely reconstruct, are not sources about Christianity. They're sources outside Christianity. For example, a lot of the stories in Mark about Jesus are taken, basically they're stories about Moses or stories about Elijah and Elisha that Mark has updated. He's done like a West Side Story to Romeo and Juliet. He's changed the historical context, the cultural context, changed the value meaning of the message, and put Jesus as the central character. So Jesus is in the role of Moses. Jesus is in the role of Elijah. But he engages in stories that are very similar and clearly lifted from and rewritten from these Old Testament, these Jewish scriptural ideas. Mark is doing that in part because they've sort of gotten tired of the old scriptures were written for a lost time, or the value message doesn't resonate anymore. So Mark is trying to sort of create a new scripture, a sort of new Moses, a new Elijah, who behaves the way that is meaningful for that particular time. Like the way Elijah acted, the way Moses acted is no longer exactly the model that they want to sell. So they're going to rewrite those stories, put them in the character of Jesus, and use Jesus as the new model. This is the new model that we're supposed to follow. So he's doing that with the scriptures, definitely. So that's going on. And Dennis MacDonald, for example, has pointed out that Mark is also doing this in a sort of Homeric style. He's taking ideas from Homer and rewriting them. And he's doing the same thing, because you got to remember, Mark is writing in Greek, like his original composition in Greek. So he is writing for a Greek audience. Anyone who could compose like he's doing, and certainly anyone who could easily read his book, knows Homer inside and out. Homer is the Bible, essentially, of the pagans, right? So Homer is the one that they take these moral lessons from. They look at these stories, and it's the same way. They treat it the same way. They don't take it literally, but they look at it as, what is the message of this scene in Homer? What value message do we get out of that? So they're extracting values in the same way that Mark is saying that you should extract values from the parables. But the author of Mark and his sect don't like the message of Homer. So they think that there's a lot of pagan values are actually corrupting of society or bad values. So what they want to do is what's called transvaluation, where they're transvaluing the stories. They'll take stories of Odysseus and other people from the Homeric tales, rewrite them so that the value message is the value message Mark wants to sell, not the value message that you get from Homer. So that this book would even replace Homer is the idea. Like, it wouldn't just replace Moses and Elijah, the old Jewish stories. It would replace the old pagan stories and be a better Homer. It could be a new core literature for this new society they want to create. And so that's what he's doing with those things. Then of course he's doing other things, like he's borrowing stories from Josephus, I think. There's been some peer-reviewed literature showing that the whole crucifixion narrative resembles in 20 points in order this other death narrative of this other Jesus who died decades after Christianity began. So he has no connection to Christianity. But it's Jesus ben Ananias, and he's killed during the siege of Jerusalem during the Jewish War. But it's a very similar story where he's prophesying the end of the world, and the Jews haul him into the Romans to get him punished, but the Romans see nothing wrong with him, and so what happens in that story is they release him, and he's killed by a siege engine during the war. But it seems pretty clear that when Mark composed his story of Jesus, he's transvaluing the Jesus ben Ananias story. So he's taking stuff from Josephus and rewriting it and turning it into something that he can market. And it's the same idea as like they want to create a new message. They saw something that worked for them in the Jesus ben Ananias story that, like, I like this message, but I'm going to pop it up a little and put some things in it and fix it up so it's exactly like we want. And then we'll just make Jesus, Ben Joseph, the character, and change the historical decade in which it occurred and the whole thing. So this is the kind of thing that Mark is doing. These are the way, this is the way that Mark is using sources. And it's not what people who want to defend historicity think using sources means. Group writing of things was not a common. In fact, I can't even think of an example of it ever in ancient literature. It's always an individual composing. What you have is an individual composes, and then someone else comes along and redacts it. So John, we know, has gone through multiple redactions. So the Gospel of John, the version we have now, is not the original one written. So in fact, someone has inserted stuff, taken stuff out, and reordered it, such that you have these weird illogical inconsistencies where Jesus is suddenly in one country and then suddenly he's in a different district instantly. So they've been put out of order, or the order of things, like this is the first miracle he did and this is the third miracle he did. We'll have those in the wrong order. So someone's moved it around. Someone's added some stuff. There's two endings to John. There's one ending and then there's another ending tacked on. We don't know which one is the original, which one was added later. And so all the experts who've written treatises on the Gospel of John have pointed out that the John we have is not the John that was originally written. Someone's meddled with it. At least one redaction has occurred, and possibly more than one. So in that sense, there are multiple authors of John, but it wasn't in the sense that it was multiple authors collaborating together. It was authors fucking with each other's work, basically. Now, the ending of John, or the last ending of John, if that's that's the one that was tacked on at the end, it does have a we. It says we basically are the authors of this book, and we are relying on this other character's previous writings or whatever, which is totally made up. But I think that's whoever wrote that is probably a particular individual representing a community. So I don't think it was actually literally multiple authors were sitting down and redacting John. I think it was one person, but he's seeing himself as a we, as representative of a collective. Like, we don't like this earlier redaction. We're going to pop it up and change this stuff. And so so we got this stuff from this other magical earlier document that I'm personally fairly certain never existed, but that's how they're selling it. There's really no such thing as collaborative document writing in the ancient world, so far as I can think of, and probably wasn't for the Gospels, but it is this kind of redaction over time, meddling with by different authors, editors. The word gospel isn't new. Gospel just means good news. It is a political word that was used in inscriptions by the state and by municipalities all the time. Like, one of the earliest gospels is the Priene Gospel, which is about Augustus, the emperor, coming in and saving them, and they write him about the savior figure, and this is the gospel, yada yada. But it's a political message. It's about he's came and he saved us, and this is the good news and about this. So this idea of a gospel, or gospel as a teaching, that's not new. That predates this. So the Christians co-opted that idea as something to market their thing. So this is the true, and it is political for them, but it's subversively political. Like, their idea is not we want to militarily take over the government, or we're not going to come in and militarily save you or anything. Their idea is we're going to spiritually save you. We are the spiritual government that you can just join this family within larger society. And larger society can go on as it is, ruled by the Romans. That's totally fine. But we will have our own society, and we're going to take care of each other. We'll have our own economy, and we'll have make sure that the poor are taken care of, and we'll have our own justice insofar as we can realize it. And then, of course, when the end comes, that we will be saved collectively, and everything else get wiped away. So they're using this political terminology to sort of market the spiritual politics, essentially. So that's where the gospel idea comes from. The other side of it, which is the way the Gospels are labeled. So The Gospels probably, when they were originally written, didn't have names on them. The Gospels are very similar to what we have with the Lives of Aesop, where there's no author. At best, there's a title, but they're anonymously written. And the Lives of Aesop are similar to the Gospels in that they're fiction. They're about someone who's believed to be historical. They feature a similar character, this countercultural character who talks back to the religious elite of his time, and it represents the poor and that kind of thing. And it has a similar storyline. Aesop eventually ends up at the central religious city and is executed for interfering with the major religious cult. And so there's a lot of similarities, but also it has many redactions. Just like you have Mark, Matthew, Luke, you have all these different versions of the Lives of Aesop, where someone just takes one version, changes it up, adds stuff, takes stuff out, and you get another version, and so on. So that's the closest parallel we actually have. And it's anonymous, so there's no author on it. And that's probably how the Gospel's originally written. There's just no author named on it. And then suddenly, sometime in the 2nd century, probably mid-2nd century, someone collected 4 of these together. And there are probably more of them around, but these were the 4 they collected and named them. And we know it's probably one person did this because they used an extremely unusual, in fact, unique method of naming them, which is in Greek to use the kata structure, where they use the preposition kata and then the name, which means according to, which is normally in ancient literature, everywhere else in ancient literature, how you cite a source, not an author. So you would say, like, if Josephus was saying, oh yeah, I got this from this other guy that I read, he would say kata and the guy's name. So according to so-and-so, this is what happened. It wouldn't be how you would name a gospel, right? So first of all, it's very unique and unusual to name a book this way, to actually have the kata as in the name and the title of it. But then suddenly you have all 4 are all named that way, by this peculiar convention. So one person had to come up with this peculiar way of naming them, and clearly that means all 4 Gospels were named by one person, which means they weren't named by the authors of the Gospels, right? So someone came along later and just assigned names. And when they did it, they didn't pretend that these were the authors. They're just naming them as the sources, as if like maybe someone dictated it or something. They're very vague as to what they mean by according to, right? Like this is our source for this text, but what do you mean by that? It doesn't say. But they just did this, and I think it was just sort of a way to sort of paper over the fact that these were anonymous Gospels, and they wanted to give them names, but not go so far as to just outright say, lie and say that so-and-so wrote this. So they kind of had this sort of wishy-washy, halfway saying that, halfway not saying that. But whoever it was, this one person came up with this idea, and all extant manuscripts that we have that have title pieces on it have the exact same thing. So it doesn't seem that any version that we have now came from any earlier version of the text. There were earlier versions of the text, but those are all, their ancestorship all died out. All the versions that we have now come from this assembled, edited version that this one person, or maybe a committee of people, got together and built. And that eventually got rubber stamped as the canon. Took a few centuries, but it sort of evolved into what became the canon. But it wasn't the first canon, right? So that collection of documents we know, which became the New Testament, we know was assembled in response to the first canon assembled by Marcion. So a few decades earlier, he's the first one to come along and assemble some books and say, this is the official collection of books for Christianity. And then this competing sect, which became the modern sect today, or the ancestor of all the modern sects today, said, oh, hell no, we're going to come up with our own in answer to yours. And then the original one vanished. We don't have it anymore. So we don't have Marcion's original canon. We have this response canon that was built later. But it was built by someone in the mid-2nd century. And it wasn't like officially declared the canon until like several hundred years later, like well after the Council of Nicaea. But even by the time the Council of Nicaea was going on, which is about the Creed, it was kind of de facto the canon. It was the way people were acting, is that this was the correct collection of books. But the original one is gone. And so, but yeah, so that's how these titles got on there, and how these names got chosen. Almost certainly the names were made up. They were chosen, based on certain strategies as to what they wanted to say about that. But yeah, so that's the New Testament that we have today is kind of like the fake second replacement New Testament to the original earlier one. Half the letters of Paul are forgeries, and that's the mainstream consensus. We know people forge documents in his name and put them in the New Testament, so we have to exclude those. But there are about 6 or 7 letters that are agreed to be authentic. And they've also been meddled with, like pieces of them have been torn out, and other letters he wrote are missing and things like that. But we have at least this core collection of texts that come from Paul. And he's writing in the 50s, so he's writing decades before Mark even, many decades before the first gospel and other gospels get written. So Mark's 7 authentic epistles are the earliest documents we have for Christianity, and they're written about 20 years after the religion began, give or take. And they're peculiar because he doesn't reference anything about the life of Jesus in there. Jesus gets born or created, incarnated, and then he gets killed and buried and resurrects. And the first time Paul first time Paul mentions anyone ever seeing him is after his death. He has this whole creed, like he says, Jesus, was crucified and buried, and he says they're crucified according to the scriptures, buried according to the scriptures, kata, using source. That's the exact same structure for the naming of the Gospels. So Paul is saying that his source is of information, where he's getting this idea that Jesus was crucified and buried. He's saying he's getting it from Scripture. Scripture is his source, not a witness, not anyone who was there or anything like that. But the first time he says anyone sees Jesus is after his death, and it says, and then he is resurrected, and then he appeared to Cephas, and then he appeared to these other apostles, and then he appeared to me, and so on. So the first time Jesus ever appears to anyone, first time there's any witness to a Jesus in Paul's writings, is after Jesus is dead, and he's appearing to them from outer space in Revelations, right? If you try to look in there for didn't Jesus handpick disciples when he was preaching the gospel? It's nowhere in Paul. And the word disciple is nowhere in Paul. Paul has no knowledge of there being disciples. He only knows apostles. And to him, an apostle is someone who had a revelation of Jesus. He has no knowledge of any other kind of way that you get to know Jesus. And so you have none of the life. Jesus is not a miracle worker. There's no mention of miracles, no mention of exorcisms. In fact, one of the creeds Paul cites that Jesus abandoned all of his powers. So that the whole idea of this cosmic idea is that he couldn't perform miracles because he abandoned all his ability to perform miracles and then was killed. And then the question is, who's killing him? Where is this occurring? And that's a whole other debate as to what that could mean. But in Paul, there's no life of Jesus. It's just not there. The whole thing is just shelled out. And the closest thing we have is he mentions, in the night that he was handed over, he broke bread and gave this instruction. But Paul says he got that by revelation, that Jesus revealed that to him. He didn't learn it from witnesses, and he doesn't mention anyone being there. So when you get to the Gospels, suddenly now there's people being mentioned being there. It's Jesus in life doing this and talking to the disciples. But when you read Paul, Jesus is speaking to future Christians. He's speaking to eternity. He's not speaking to a select, limited group that's with him. He's talking to all Christians, and it seems like a revelation that Jesus did this. So even that we can't really place into the gospel history and that kind of concept. So what's going on here? Like, why does Paul not know any of the stories? Why does Paul not know any of the parables? When Paul wants to teach something, he has these revelations. He says, "Oh, I have a revelation from Jesus, and this is what he said." He doesn't have a collection of sayings. He doesn't have stories to tell about Jesus. "Oh, you remember, you should do what Jesus did. You remember when he did this thing?" No, that kind of, he doesn't use analogies from Jesus' life. It's like none of the things that you would expect. If someone's trying to push this religion and say, you should follow the dictates of this guy, you should follow him as a model, you'd be talking about his life, you'd be talking about things he did and as examples proving your point. And even if you're writing 20,000 words on someone, it's exceedingly difficult to avoid ever mentioning anything happening in their life, even by accident, right? So it's very odd. And so this is one of the principal bases, I think, of arguing that maybe there wasn't a Jesus. Maybe this is stuff that all went on, as they understood it, celestially, and it was only known by revelation and only known by secret messages in Scripture. And that's the thesis, of course, that I test against minimal historicity on the historicity of Jesus, the book I wrote about this and got through peer review. It's like the only peer-reviewed defense of the idea that Jesus didn't exist. And it holds up, I think. But it certainly is worth debating. It's worth taking seriously that that's what happened. I mean, honestly, nowadays, no one reads the Bible, so so they don't even read it in the order that it's in now. When people read the Bible, they're told by a preacher to look up a specific verse, and so they flip to that verse and read that verse. No one really sits down and reads the New Testament cover to cover in order. Like that no longer happens. And arguably, it never really happened. In the medieval churches, or even pre-medieval, churches would read the Gospels section by section, week after week. So it'd be like basically a liturgy. So they have like a 52-week plan that would finish a Gospel. You would just read a section every week. And so for that was just their manner of preaching. So that's why they put those in front, because that's the churches were using it that way. But people weren't like reading the Gospels in order. Like the order wasn't really important. And in fact, we have versions of the New Testament that have the books in different orders, but never the epistles first, I don't think. But certainly like the Gospels sometimes are in different orders, and the epistles sometimes are in different orders. So the organization has become kind of like, well, you've got the Gospels, then we're going to throw in the epistles, and then we'll throw the Revelation at the end. And then the epistles are organized in like all of Paul's epistles, and then you have like the minor authors, and then their number of epistles shrink or go up, or go one direction or the other. And so they just sort of pack them on. It's very similar to the way the Quran is organized. But it wasn't really organized that way for people to read it in that order. The order is kind of irrelevant. And today it's certainly not. I don't think it would have any effect on people's understanding it, because that's not how people get sold Christianity. It's not how they're taught to learn about Christianity, and it's not what they're preached. So the preachers don't say, hey, read the Bible cover to cover in order. The order is important. That's not how they do it. So I don't think it would have any effect if we were to reorder the Bible. Biblical scholars in the 20th century started to notice, well, they've noticed for a long time, but they really started to really dig into why this was the case. Everybody knows that Matthew copies Mark verbatim and Luke copies Mark verbatim. So we know they're both just redacting Mark. But there's material in Matthew and Luke that's not in Mark that's verbatim between Matthew and Luke. And so we have this question, it's like, where's that material coming from? Because either Luke is copying Matthew or Matthew is copying Luke, or there's some other gospel that's lost that they're copying. So maybe there's some other gospel parallel to Mark, and they're copying stuff from Mark, and they're copying stuff from this other gospel, and now it's lost, and that's how they got built up. And this is where the Q theory originated. And that hypothetical lost gospel was named Q. It's for the German Quelle, meaning source. So it's just this source document. They call it Q. And so whenever you hear people talking about Q in the context of the New Testament, they're talking about this hypothetical lost gospel. And then there's lots of debates as to when was that gospel written? Did it go through multiple redactions? Is it post-Mark? Is it pre-Mark? It's all of that kind of stuff. But there have been other scholars who've said, you know what, actually that hypothesis is not such a great hypothesis. Actually, it makes much more sense that Luke just copied from Mark and Matthew. So Luke is basically redacting Mark and Matthew. Matthew is Q, essentially, in this. Luke doesn't have a Q. Matthew's not using a Q. Matthew just added stuff to Mark, and Luke came along and then redacted that material as well. Mark Goodacre is one of the leading proponents these days of that. So if you look at The Case Against Q is his leading book on this, but he's written many other things. And I've looked at this, and I have to say, after all my research, I have to agree that the argument for Q is just really terrible. There really isn't any good argument for Q. And the theory that Luke is just redacting Mark and Matthew explains a lot more data than the Q hypothesis does. And now there are a lot of us in the scholarly community who agree with the fact that Q doesn't exist. But I'd say we're still a minority, maybe 1 out of every 3. So it's like there's still like this old guard that's really insistent on defending Q. Although Kloppenborg is one of the big leading defenders of Q. Even he had to admit, like in one of his trying really hard to defend the Q, he says, well, he basically said, I'm paraphrasing, he basically says like 50-50 as to whether there was a Q or not. It's like, okay, you're almost giving up on Q at that point. So I think, Q is a hypothetical document. We don't have it. We don't even have really concrete evidence that it ever existed. So it makes it very difficult to use. And yet a lot of scholars have these grandiose theories about what was in Q, how it was redacted over time, really elaborate theories, and this explains all kinds of things they want to say about the origins of Christianity, but it's all built on this facade of hypothesis on top of hypothesis on top of hypothesis on top of hypothesis. Very little evidence backs it. So I don't really support the existence of Q, and I don't think it's useful as evidence to really treat that hypothesis as if it's evidence of something. It needs evidence for it, not the other way around. Why is there this obsession to stick with a historical Jesus rather than admitting that maybe there wasn't one? Even just to admit that maybe there wasn't one, rather than just saying there wasn't one, right? You could say like, yeah, okay, it's possible there wasn't one. And I've had some leading scholars in the field like tell me privately, like, yeah, actually, I'm not really convinced, like it's 50-50, like maybe there wasn't one, but I really can't like publicly say that because that would be damaging to my career. People would make fun of me. It would be, cause problems for me essentially. So there's still this sort of field pressure against people to like, no, don't go there. Don't ever go there. And I think, so there's partly that, and there's this lesson to have learned. A lot of these scholars who are thinking like this saw what happened to Thomas Thompson in the 70s. Thomas Thompson is a professor of the Old Testament, and he's the first one to come out with a peer-reviewed study claiming, hey, Moses and Abraham and the patriarchs are mythical. They didn't exist. And the effort to destroy his career was phenomenal. So there was like all kinds of things within the field, like to get him disinvited, get him kicked out of conferences, to get his papers not reviewed, to not prevent him from getting a job anywhere. And so he went through a lot of crap over that, like really problematic crap. And people in the field still remember that having happened. And so when you say, well, now you're writing like Jesus didn't exist, I'm not going on that third rail because look what happened to Thomas Thompson, I'm not going there. And you have people within the religious universities are in worse shape because they definitely can't go there. You have the example of Thomas Brody, who wrote a memoir. He's a Catholic priest, and he wrote a memoir saying, I don't think Jesus existed. And the Vatican said, okay, yeah, you're retired now. You don't get to talk about this anymore. You're going to shut up. And so they silenced him, and he's gone now. He's off in some retirement community, not holding a position anymore, and not allowed to talk to anybody, as far as we know. So that was the end of that. So you have this. Within the religious communities, it's even worse. But even within the secular community, like if you're a biblical studies professor, who's your audience? Where is your grant money coming from? Where is your departmental funding coming from? It's coming from Christians and Christian institutes. And so you don't want to like rock that boat. So even if you're secular, there's a risk there. The scholars who can come out and say, I doubt Jesus existed, or at least I'm not convinced he did, are scholars who are insulated from being harmed. Or have realized they are. I think a lot more scholars are immune to being harmed than they think they are. I think a lot of scholars think they're in more danger than they are, and that keeps them quiet. But some have come out and said, yeah, actually, I am kind of a doubter of this. And so you have Hector Avalos, you have Art Droge, you have Kurt Knoll, you have a variety of these professors in the field who come out and say, like, yeah, actually, I do doubt the historicity of Jesus. But there are people that can't be punished, essentially. So they're in there. So you have to look at other people. So that's a factor. But I think it's also a factor that careers are built on the historicity of Jesus. Like, it's going to be really difficult to like switch around and say, actually, I'm going to repudiate all of my life's work and say that actually I was wrong about everything about the origins of Christianity else because I think there's no Jesus. That can be very difficult personally to do. There's some people in the field have, they're married to people who would be very upset if they were to suggest that there was not a Jesus anymore. So there's a lot of these things, but it's also kind of like, and this is said about Q, for example, that Q is a juggernaut, that it's that there's so much invested in it that no one is willing to like admit that it doesn't exist. They're so bought into this hypothesis that they just won't listen to any reason and say like, I don't care what the evidence says, I'm convinced there was a Q, and how dare you suggest there's not. I think the historicity of Jesus has become that too. Like there's this institutional fossilization. It's like, well, of course that's the mainstream. Everything else is ridiculous. La, la, la. I'm not going to listen to the challenging of this. How dare we go there? So there's that kind of institutional inertia, I think, is also a problem for why this happens. And so I think all of these factors come in. But I think what you're going to see is that the new guard is going to be more free to be open about this. And you're going to see the old guard die off, and you're going to see probably more and more acceptance of this, at least the plausibility that Jesus didn't exist. Not necessarily like adopting the hypothesis that he didn't, but at least saying, yeah, that's as plausible as the zealot hypothesis that's also going on in the field, or the apocalyptic prophet hypothesis, or the Jesus the magician hypothesis, or Jesus the cynic hypothesis. There's all of these different hypotheses about the historical Jesus. The non-existent hypothesis, this other alternative theory for the origins of Christianity, is at least as plausible as all those others. And so it deserves equal respect and a place at the table of the debate, essentially. That actually ties into your last question. So let me see if I can wrap that up. So another aspect of this, like when you look at like the Jesus seminar, why are they so invested in there being a historical Jesus, even when they're willing to admit most of the stuff about him is made up? Like if you're willing to say most of it's made up, why aren't you just go all the way and say, well, if most of it's made up, maybe all of it's made up. So why don't they go there? But a lot of the members of the Jesus Seminar aren't necessarily secular. They're liberal believers. They're Christians, and they have these ideas. So you have like John Dominic Crossan, for example, has this idea of Jesus that actually matches what he wants to preach in terms of the moral universe, like what moral message he wants to preach. So it becomes important that this is really how Jesus even became historicized in the first place, is that if your hero doesn't exist, it's a much harder sell to say that he's the great moral guide for something. Oh, you mean someone made him up? That's the great moral guide? But if he's real and really said and did the things that you say he said and did, you can say like, oh, look, he is a real moral authority. And so it has more weight, has more psychological effect on people. and on yourself, right? So if you want to model yourself after this guy, it's easier to model yourself after someone you believe existed than after a fictional character, let's say. It's not that no one can do that. It's just that it's easier for a lot of people to do that if they believe in the historicity of that person. And that's how Moses gets historicized, for example. It's like why Moses is so important and why Abraham is so important. And the same thing with Jesus. And so I think there are a lot of scholars who really invested in historicity because they're invested in some theology, some idea of what they understand Jesus to have been. And there have been other scholars who pointed out that when they look at this huge diversity of theories of who the historical Jesus was, there's like tons of different versions of Jesus, tons of different versions of what he really taught originally and stuff. What someone said is like, what I've noticed is when you look at a scholar and you look at his politics and you look at his what he wants to be true religiously, and then you look at the Jesus he's reconstructed, it's conveniently the same. And so this, like, what seems to be happening is that people are looking down a well and seeing themselves reflected back at them and then calling it Jesus, really, right? So you have this trend in scholarship to build your historical Jesus to be the one you want for your own politics and for your own moral vision for society. And of course, that keeps you anchored to defending historicity because you need historicity to do that. So that's kind of still a barrier for people. But there are a lot of people who are willing to say, actually, there's no reconstruction of Jesus that makes sense to me now. It's the same problem that the original Christians had with Moses and Abraham and Homer. It's like those documents, the morals that they were teaching are like thousands of years old or hundreds of years old. They no longer speak to our current generation. So they rewrite, they create their gospels and have Jesus be the version that they want. We're now in the same place. Like the Jesus that's in the Gospels no longer resonates today. If you actually read the Gospels, he's kind of a dick. He's super moralistic. He doesn't really fit in. He doesn't have a lot to say to our current generation and the kind of moral struggles we're dealing with now. What we have now is that we've gone to a high reliance on fiction. So we have Star Trek, we have Star Wars, we have we have Harry Potter. We have Harry Potter's a good example. We have even Game of Thrones, where we have these fictional universes that explore moral problems and explore political problems and give us parables that we can use to teach, like, yeah, this is what a good person is like. This is what a bad person is like. This is what makes a good society. This is what makes a bad society. This is how you deal with this moral problem. This is how you not deal with this moral problem. We're now using fiction as models to do this. So we're doing it so effectively now that we don't need to believe they're true. We don't need to believe Harry Potter really existed to have to understand that there are valuable moral lessons in Harry Potter. And so, and that's what's happening now. So people are moving more towards looking at fiction as their source of their scriptures, and they're just no longer needing it to be literally true. They're no longer needing it to be inerrant, for example. And so that's the direction we're going. And I think in terms of like religious, like you lose this religious package, you lose this worldview, you lose your anchor in terms of your identity and your sense of where you fit in the world and how the world works and all of this. You do have to replace it. Like you've got to put something back in there, even to make sense of your life or the world, even to interact with the world. You have to make assumptions about it. And so that requires some replacement. And what it should be philosophy. We should go back from religion back to philosophy. The way the pagan intellectuals did is like they moved from these religious doctrines to philosophy. Philosophy was kind of like this formalization of, we're going to get rid of like this tradition and stuff and actually start asking questions about evidence-based, logic-based construction of a worldview. That's what philosophy was in antiquity. And it was a replacement for religion. It sometimes integrated religion, but it was really the replacement for religion. It wasn't scripture-based, it was philosophy-based. We need to do that again. But unlike antiquity, where philosophy was fundamental in the education system, it is not anymore. So philosophy is this fringe ivory tower doctrine, and even professional philosophers, are really cut off from the real world. They're not talking to the common people. They're not resonating with the common people. So you have this problem where we need the common people to really pursue philosophy the way they pursue their religion and use philosophy as, like, you can answer your own questions, you can dialogue with people, you can explore stuff, and you can build your own worldview, build this idea. You don't need a religious package to be sold you. You can construct your own, but you need the skills to do that. You need to even know that you're supposed to do that. It has to be something that has to be promoted. But we have not integrated that kind of technique, that philosophy, as a fundamental part of our culture. It's not something we're teaching our kids. It's not something that people are growing up with. And if they go and look at philosophy, say, oh, you need philosophy, and they go look at the ivory tower, and they go, what the hell is that? Like, that has nothing to do with what I need. they're not talking about the stuff that I want to deal with, and it's obscure and so on. So we've got this gap where we're not filling it, and we do need to fill that. And I don't know what the policy recommendation is for this, but there's something in terms of our culture, we do need to go there. Many people are finding that on their own, but not enough people. And what's happening is people are assembling worldviews unconsciously. So you get this political factionalization going on in the world today. So people are building worldviews based on mythologies. Like you look at libertarians or Sanders fans or whatever it is, pick any side of the political spectrum. They have a body of mythology that justifies their political beliefs. That mythology is often false stories or jiggered stories. It's just another religion, right? But they're falling into it happenstance, right? They're not thinking it through. It's not something that they're reasoning out. They're just ending up with these worldviews that get cobbled onto them. And I don't think that's healthy or productive. I think we need to teach people the skill to you need to question everything and then figure out what holds up under questioning and then build your own worldview out of that in a skilled, rational, evidence-based way. We're just not teaching people to do that, and we really should. We really should be promoting that.